and you can't possibly agree with all of us. So I'm expecting Dan's looking like he wants to say something.
I'm going to start before Dan, since he already said that I've been there longer, and I'm 3 offices up from him. So one of the data points I didn't bring up, and it really is a lot of the early readings on fiber, is that people have lived on fiber-free diets in enteral nutrition for many, many years, suggesting that fiber is not, and then probably they're not. So that's kind of the old data on why it's not an essential nutrient.
You said enteral, did you mean?
I'm enteral, old enteral, people that were in nursing homes for 20 years and they lived with 0 fiber. Now the enteral products have all added fiber because they know it's good for health, but that's kind of another data point used to show that it's not an essential nutrient for life.
Let me follow up on this. Dan's young enough he can remember what he has to say. In the 1980s, John Rombo and I published a series of papers in animal models looking at translocation of bacteria from the gut into the abdominal lymph nodes. And in the hamster model, the reason we chose that model was it recapitulates what happens in humans who are on long-term enteral nutrition. They do get bacterial translocation. So I don't think it's benign to have an enteral fiber-free formula. They're not dying from a deficiency, but they are certainly more susceptible to bacterial sepsis on that. And if you add fermentable fiber, you completely eliminate that. Dr. Gallagher.
Well, thank you. So this is a different way of thinking about it, I think, is that ask the question about dietary fiber in the context of, let me back up. A defining characteristic of dietary fiber is that mammalians don't have the enzymes to break it down. The question is, why is that? Why can we not break it down? Why did we not evolve the enzymes to break it down like the bacteria? How did that happen? So a way of thinking about that is that we didn't evolve the ability to break down dietary fiber because it was of an evolutionary benefit to us to have a source of carbohydrate pass into the large intestine. Why would that be? Because it would promote a saccharolytic fermentation versus a proteolytic fermentation. And there's good evidence to show that that's a benefit. So I don't personally think that dietary fiber is an essential, but is it a benefit? I think we can think of it in evolutionary terms, perhaps, that we could justify it that way. Just a thought.
I agree with you totally, Dan, and I think, if you go into what Dennis presented, if you go into the IOM and DRIs, it says it is not an essential nutrient. So if we have to base our teaching in human nutrition on the DRIs, it's documented, it is not an essential nutrient in the usual way nutrient is essential. Better for health, yes.
You talk evolution, but we evolved to have an ecosystem, the microbiota, which is now almost considered an organ by itself, the microbiota. And in that process, the combination between the microbiota and all the cells involved with the innate and acquired immune system, there's a communication. So in that regards, there's essentiality. And they communicate back and forth, like the production of short-chain fatty acid. So I'll just say that.
So I want to ask this question that comes up all the time. So now we're having a fiber symposium. And on the other hand, you have a symposium of people that talk about low FODMAP diets, gluten-free diet in people that are not celiacs. So how do you feel this? What's your feel about that?
Okay, there's another, kid on the block who has an idea, and it may be good. Fermentation may be bad. Early in my career, help me, Dave, who was the guy who got ostracized increased fermentation was going to cause cancer.
Oh, Lucy and Jacob.
Lucy.
Lucy and Jacobs. So there will always be these theories. And there's always what you'd call, in the Gaussian distribution, too little fiber or too much fiber, say, too much fermentation. But on the big picture, for most of us in the room, without maybe a major genetic defect, some autoimmune, fiber is beneficial. And enough fiber will prime you just to be, that's the other thing. I'm only talking about normal, healthy, but everybody knows what's normal, healthy, right? Did that answer in a way? That was my opinion on that.
Well, it's actually, that's what, you know, particularly in the field of irritable bowel syndrome, we too much, increased visceral hypersensitivity, so more gas being produced, and then they get more symptoms. So, of course, I asked the question, same thing, what does it do to the microbiota? Because, you know, the microbiota also is important for the IBS development. So they say, well, no, that's not proven. And, I mean, the field is rapidly moving into low fodmaps, almost all clinicians prescribe the diet for IBS, but what are we really doing?
I totally agree with you, and that's the frustrating thing in science, in that we have a lot of information, we believe in fiber, but fermentation for certain people is not good. And so when we go from health to disease, there are people that have a disease diagnosis, but there's a lot of people in this middle ground, and they're looking for answers. And the answer they're finding right now is low FODMAPs, and the data is really unfair in the low FODMAPs world. So to put all of these carbohydrates together in this new category of bad guys is very bad for our whole field. So I appreciate your comments.
Dr. Liska.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a question, but maybe get your comments on this, because Joanne, you mentioned we can all agree that fiber as part of food are foods that we want to encourage. But I think one of the places where there is some discussion is when fiber is taken out of the context of those foods, either as an isolate or as bran or you know, separately and added to other foods. So I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that aspect of fiber and the benefit of fiber along with.
Yeah, I'm a dietitian, so food is my life. I always want food. And if you go back a long time ago, the original enteral diets were just blended food, right? So it was fruits and vegetables, and people actually did a little better on those than when we have enteral diets with just added fiber, for sure. So there's some advantages to food because of we don't know what, right? Maybe a combination. I believe that's what's good about FDA actually coming up with some to make sure that there is some data that any isolated fiber that's added back in has some physiological benefit to protect consumers. Because right now I spend a ton of my time talking to people about fake fibers, and all they ever say is these are fake, and I say no, these aren't fake. These fibers, almost all the research that's out there on fiber are isolated fibers that have a health benefit. These are the ones that they have. So for sure, my dietitian side says it would be great to get people to get the fiber recommendations in their food. I'm all over that. I want that to happen. But I believe that the way people eat now, it's not going to happen. It hasn't happened in my lifetime, and I've been talking about fiber for a really long time, and people eat less fiber. So I can't take any credit for changing their dietary behavior. I believe that fiber has to be added into foods and beverages. And so that's why I think it's good that FDA is actually kind of laying down the law and saying, let's make sure that the fibers that are going back in have some physiological benefits. So then when consumers come to us and say, these are fake fibers, these don't have any benefits, you're misleading us, these are processed foods, therefore they're crap, we'll have some background to say, no, these are tested fibers. And as a chemist, which is where I start, I know all of these fibers that are non-digestible and absorbable are going to have some interesting physiological effects. So I really do believe in all fibers, but there's just a ton of misinformation out there now that these isolated fibers are not effective when I know they really are.
I want to add a comment. Whole foods, all kind of good fiber, endogenous. So we add anything that's a non-digestible carbohydrate. Once we put it in the body, I don't care if you have 1 molecule or 10 grams, the body will react. And it's the sum of all those components, non-digestible, that contributes to a physiological effect. And some of the effects that I talked about. I avoided the topics of lowering cholesterol, glucose, attenuating glucose or insulin or weight, losing or hypertension. What's the best way to achieve those, lower those? Weight management. Is fiber, fiber going to do that?
Good.
Well,
It's one of the 9.
Anyway, my point, Ed, whatever the body ingests, it's essentially perceived as a fiber, and it acts as a fiber going all the way through.
One comment that I would add to that is if the primary function of dietary fiber consumption is to feed the microbiome, your bacteria don't know the difference between intrinsic versus added fiber.
With the ADM, and we talk a lot about the science. We did achieve a lot of success or understanding about fiber, scientifically or whatever, already know. And also we know the situation of public health. My question is, we do so much work down there, working hard, FDA, USDA, LC, academic people. If I say during the last 20 years, the US population, usual fiber intake, no meaningful increase, what's the problem? Number one. Number two is, if we know the problem, how can we quickly resolve the problem? We don't want to see the last 20 years, 10 years, we do so much work, we have so passionately working on these things, but just no real benefits to the mass production concern.
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
You can start.
Well, I think part of the problem is that nutritionists have had a very puritanical approach to dietary recommendations for decades, that we're telling people, you need to eat this list of foods that I tell you I know is healthier. And Americans say, see you later. And so they go to the store and they buy donuts and French fries and all the sorts of things that the federal government says you shouldn't be eating too much of. Not that you can't eat it, but we're eating too much of those kinds of foods. So the question is, can we meet consumers halfway? And can we improve those foods to make them healthier? I'm not saying you're going to eat a health food donut, but can you make a donut healthier by adding a few grams of fiber? Do you know how hard it is to consume your daily requirement of fiber from whole wheat bread? You know, you have to eat 1.5 pounds of whole wheat bread to get your 38 grams. That's not feasible for most people. So I really think, as Joanne said, we've got to add fiber to foods and beverages that Americans are consuming.
The question is, do we have other reasons like a regulation block or unreasonably unclear instruction, guidelines, rules? There's something like that?
No.
Nope.
No.
Well, I think you got to remember what's good about fiber because it's universally promoted. And so I agree with David that we need to allow it into snack foods and meet people in fast food, wherever they're eating, help get fiber into those foods and get the dietitians and other people that are out there that have this idea that fiber that's isolated is fake and junk and cheating. So it's a long education process, but I think that's the future because most foods only have 1 to 3 grams of fiber, so we're not going to make it on real food.
Just a comment. Again, you're in the industry, correct?
Yes.
It's a never-ending challenge to make a quality product that tastes good, the consumer accepts. Whole grains, it's just a challenge to make a good product, and you must know that. You're an industry. But
Dr. Fahey.
So I want to go home and start immediately on this new fiber regimen. So I'd like to know the formulation. So let's start out with what's your feeling about the I assume you agree with the 28 to 35 grams perhaps, but what's the ratio of insoluble to soluble in this essential mix?
Wow.
75-25. Insoluble to soluble, same as anything else. You can eat it on the street. Go get street food, it'll be the same, but just keep it right there in the middle.
I agree, but I think, again, you're going to have more soluble in there to increase the growth of the total microbiota. And in that regards, we're going to look at maybe 40 to 50 grams a day of, quote, diet. Oh, that's another issue.
But,
the measurement of dietary fiber.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
sure. But, so you're assuming all the insoluble is unfermentable?
No,
No, I
it's
think
about
that's-
half.
No, a majority, a high percentages, if you look at all the solubles, generally a good percentages, right?
Right.
And then when you go to the oligosaccharides, they're almost quantitatively, if you can tolerate them.
If you can tolerate it, right?
I think we should go back and look at some of this old data too, where
Yeah.
the soluble fiber in the 90s and Lucian Jacobs, everybody's like, oh, that's not right, that can't be right, and actually take a look at it and learn. And so often we're such big promoters that we walk right by really important data. So I think you can get your fiber from lots of different sources. There isn't one fiber that we all need to get. You know, that's.
You don't have any recommendations for the cellulose versus hemicellulose versus pectin versus oligosaccharides? Do you have a formula that you could give us for that?
Do you know that plate I just showed you?
Yeah.
You were watching myplate.gov, and the number of servings from that. If you follow that, you'll be right where you need to be.
I hope
That's all
this
you
is
have to do.
an important point. Every day we eat a different diet. Every day we have a different load of different type of carbohydrates. And in doing so, that diversity gives us the benefits I tried to explain, but what's missing is quantity. And the right selection of more whole foods, and then how properly are we going to fortify these foods in our beverages?
I agree. I think if you did the 28 to 35 at a 75-25, you'd be well on the way to optimization.
And we can do it for your dog, but we can't do it for you, because we have more time for your dog. But just follow him around.
You should bring that up. Because dogs have the same digestive diseases, and we work a little bit with dogs. And the 75-25 or 80-20 is the ideal ratio, because dogs are like having a youngster, an infant all the time, because you have to take your dog out, and usually you have to pick up and drop it, right? So people are very interested in the stool quality, and if there's a change, they're calling their vet, the worst person in the world to ask, but nevertheless, that's who they call, and wonder why that this is happening. And pet food companies live and die by palatability and stool quality.
And we do too, but we just
And
don't
we do
talk
too.
about it.
Dr. Schneeman.
So first a note of caution, then my comment. So note of caution, if it gets perceived that the reason we want fiber to be essential is so that we can add it to any food and just ignore a basic diet. I'm just saying, if that's the way it's perceived, that's a cautionary note. That's not a good rationale to move forward on essentiality. But my comment, and I'm actually hoping that Paula might take off her FDA hat, and we should remember that when the macronutrient report came out, Paula worked at IOM, and as I recall, this round of the DRIs was the first time that chronic disease endpoints could be used as a marker for essentiality for making dietary recommendations. And I may be wrong, but I think dietary fiber is the only place where chronic disease endpoint was used. Is that, Paula's shaking her head.
No.
But
Calcium.
Sodium.
Yeah, sodium. No.
But it's a place where the
Fluoride.
recommendation
This is 5.
was set.
Yeah, there are others like calcium.
Come to the microphone, Paula.
Yeah.
And fluoride, those were the ones for dental caries. So those were the ones, but I think when the DRI panels were looking at nutrients and setting ARs and RDAs, or sometimes AIs, for essential nutrients, it was really kind of what was shot up there, but they didn't go into a lot of detail. It's the understanding that part of a nutrient being essential in the diet is that if it's not in the diet, then there is a nutrient deficiency that is nutrient specific. So iron deficiency anemia, scurvy. And so when we get into chronic diseases or physiological effects, they're multifactorial. And so they're not nutrient specific. And also, I think the issue was it's essential for the human body, not for the microbiota. So I think that's where it was coming from. But fiber clearly was one of them. Kind of a parallel, I would say, the fiber is the EPA-DHA issue, where some think it's essential, some do not. And again, it gets to, is it essential in the body? And then with the enteral feeding, that reminded me about going back about how the essential fatty acids were determined to be essential, and that was from enteral feeding, if I remember, where there were specific essential fatty acid deficiencies that were shown because the enteral diets did not include what was it, linoleic acid and linolenic acid.
Yes.
I'll acknowledge.
Yeah, just if I could pick up on a few of those that, so then when you're thinking about the DRI, so if you do this for vitamin C, you come up with an EAR, you know that 50% of the population is adequate, 50% inadequate. If you add vitamin C to a diet, you know the effect you're going to get. Whereas with something like dietary fiber, you may not be meeting the AI, but if you add fiber to the diet, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get in terms of responding. I'm just laying these out as part of the complications that we have to be thinking about. That's why I like what you were saying earlier around stool weight, where can we actually get to a point where this much fiber, this much stool weight? But then the next question is, what's the stool weight that is
Linked to health.
For health?
Right.
But getting to specifics like that, where you have a much more defined, you can think about that bell-shaped curve, and where are you on that bell-shaped curve? So, there is an it's not IOM anymore, I keep forgetting what it is now, but there is a committee that is looking at this issue of chronic disease risk endpoints, so there's still opportunity to think about how that plays into essentiality. But it's just a bigger part of the picture that comes into this question.
Barbara, to comment on, it's not about increasing consumption, using it as a marketing tool. It's just trying to explain the total benefits of a mixed fiber diet to the entire intestine. And
I understand that, I get that, I talk about it all the time. It's more, what's the perception when you leave the room?
But then we get the rules and regulations. It's to increase it for the benefit without another rule. I mean, okay, establish an AI or an ER or whatever. Okay.
Patricia.
Hi, Patricia lives in Cargill. So just kind of to build on some of the recent conversations, kind of funny that I got in line at the right time. So around essentiality, maybe what we're looking for, the symptoms of deficiency, maybe they're just not outward and visible in a way that we've seen with, say, iron deficient anemia, where maybe we do need to pay attention to some of the things that Dr. Madsen was mentioning. The signs of deficiency might be more internalized. Maybe it's the decreases in mucosal layer, maybe it's the gap junctions and the decreased barrier function. Maybe what we're looking for is a test of barrier function to define the essentiality of fiber rather than, although stool weight is perfectly fine in my mind, I agree with Joanne. but maybe something more specific, something more sophisticated might be appropriate. And so that's just my first thought. And, my second thought is, are we suffering from a lack of being specific on what is dietary fiber? Do we need to have something that is kind of akin to what protein has for amino acids? Looking at the essentiality in amino acids and being more specific about a quality assessment. Is it a specific chain length? Is it a type of oligo? Does it have to do with certain branching that is determined as resistant to digestion? So if you have alpha 1,2 linkages versus alpha 1,4, and what amount, is that something that can be kind of focused in on? Or do we want to keep continuing in this broader, fluffy landscape of dietary fiber and needing to have a multitude of sources, which I'm okay with too. I think that there's a place to be had for all of them because it's going to be in different places for different people's needs, and meeting some of the stuff that was brought up earlier about this is kind of that adaption that we've been kind of blessed with over millennia.
A comment I'll make is not to make it so complex. For basic research, you may look at chain length, branching, chemistry, physical properties, on and on. But again, I come back for maybe the consumer or me, you. We have one entity called dietary fiber, one entity on a label. People want fiber and they want to accept that it has beneficial effects, right? But I'm going so far as to see, and that's the whole point of today. It's to open up discussion. What is the value of fiber? And again, to me, it has an essential function, but how to put it in the right context to be accepted. Can I come back? Karen. Sepsis is a disease or a disorder caused mainly by malnutrition, correct?
No.
Most septic individuals are malnourished.
No.
Well,
A lot of
does
them are.
Not.
diet help them, a nutritionally balanced diet, help them recover
They're too sick
for
to eat.
sepsis?
Once they're recovered, if they're through antibiotics, yeah, but before that, yeah.
When they're but to get there, isn't it usually through some?
I mean, usually they're quite ill.
Yeah, that's what I.
And I think that's important for us to divide here too, well people versus ill people. And if there were some markers to kind of, that's where the fiber is lacking, is that if there were some blood markers or easy markers to identify people that aren't getting enough fiber and not the right type of fiber, that would be fabulous, but we don't really have that. And I agree with George that the usual recommendation is you don't want all of your fiber from the same place. So probably similar to the diet, 75% insoluble, 25% soluble for the average healthy person is a good place to go and try to meet the recommendations, the amounts, which is a huge step up. We need to double where we're at, so there's a lot of stuff to do.
But just to follow up on Joanne's comment about a marker for fiber, we heard in the workshop at NIH the last 2 days that there are literally hundreds of compounds circulating in the plasma, excreted in the urine, that are derived from the bacterial microbiome. So I think it's a researchable question that will provide answers in the next few years about finding a marker for the amount of fiber that's being consumed. Kathy.
Several thoughts. Joanne, when you brought up the 75-25, are you going back to the 1980, if I remember correctly, the FASIB report on fiber? That's where that number was first talked about in terms of sort of a scientific, the science at that time suggested that might be an appropriate.
For the average healthy person as a goal, like there's no reason to completely flip that and go the other way.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I think that's an interesting thought that is worth thinking through again. But secondly, I want to go back. I think, Dave, you presented the idea of bioactive versus essential. And I'm just curious if I think most people in this room would probably say for sure fiber is bioactive, but I think we can argue a long time about the essentiality. And so when I think about that, And we were just talking about the chronic disease risk. And Dennis, when you presented on, from mouth to anus, it was all only related to laxation, but yet we do have health claims, for example, on some of the soluble fibers Joanne mentioned. And so is there some opportunities that we're missing in trying to go back and look at those endpoints, those more of a chronic disease relationship endpoints that maybe just require a different way of looking at the science or a different way to research some of these things to start to build that, assuming that, if there are the correct biomarkers that we need, and there's a big question around that. It just seems like there's a lot of more in-depth science that's going to be needed in order to somehow get to some of those big chronic disease endpoints. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or if that was completely off the wall.
Bioactive dead.
That's what it's for, why we're here.
No. In fact, I agree with everything you said, and I think that's the issue, that there are a lot of researchable questions around fiber and demonstrating essentiality, and Dennis and I have been crusading about this for a number of years, and
I don't think it's essential to be essential. That's the way I feel about fiber. It's already on the label, it's already there, so it doesn't need to be crowned essential. So that's where I come from.
we're going to have to let just one more question, because we need a break.
Yeah, one quick question. With the 25% soluble, does that have to be high molecular weight soluble, or can it be intermediate? The reason being, 25% soluble, if you're talking about, say, guaiacum or beta-glucan ADCOM, it doesn't get past your mouth. Once you get it in your mouth, you're then sort of trying to dig it out so you can swallow it. But if you made it intermediate molecular weight, you make it easy to get into a product. And we do see there's problems now with the FODMAPs, that if we use the fructooligosaccharides or some of the galactooligosaccharides and the others, that if they're going to go routinely into food, they're going to have to be labelled as low molecular weight fibres, because there'll be a lot of people out there will eat a bar, think it's great for them, next thing you know they'll blow up like a balloon, and they won't want to be in an elevator at the time.
I agree, and I think some of the ones that are, like partially PHGG, the products that are out there would absolutely count in that soluble fiber. So I'm not putting that in, I'm not voting for anybody, inulin, any soluble fiber as a balance, and a combination. I think that, like if you look in the enteral world, most people are going to blends. There's no perfect fiber, there's no horrible fiber, but if you put them together, that's the way we put a diet together, and the dietetics world is variety. So I would not say that any soluble fiber would have to be in there, but I totally agree that the gums, they're hard to formulate and eat.